Empires aren't built by being nice. Now, publicly executing criminals is nothing new, but ancient Rome took torture and criminal justice to levels of astonishing creativity that are hard to rival. Sure, they did have simple beheadings, and there's also the infamous Tarpeian Rock, a cliff face in Rome that convicted traitors were hurled off of. These methods of punishment weren't always enough, however, and the Romans wasted no time in devising other means for when they really wanted to send a message. By far, the most famous method of execution used by the Romans was crucifixion. The idea of attaching someone to a slab of wood didn't start with Rome, and was used by the Persians, Seleucids, and Carthaginians. In Rome, crucifixion was used mostly to punish slaves, disgraced soldiers, foreigners, and pirates, and was rarely used against Roman citizens. The crucifixion process usually started with scourging or whipping of the victim, who was then forced to carry their cross to the place of execution. It was likely that the condemned criminal didn't actually carry the entire cross, but just the crossbeam, with the upright post of the cross fixed permanently in place. The victim's arms would then be attached to the crossbeam. This could be done by driving nails into the wrists of the victim, or the arms could be tied on. It was also possible that the arms would be draped over the back of the beam and tied or nailed in place. The beam was then raised up and attached to the upright post, with the feet tied or nailed to it. There is surprisingly little direct information about how exactly crucifixion was carried out, with the placement of the limbs and the number of nails and their location still debated by scholars. More than likely, there was no specific way to do it, and executioners spiced things up as they went along. Once on the cross, the victim would survive in agony anywhere from a few hours to several days. They would endure shock, blood loss, dehydration, and exposure, and as time went on, they would suffer from slowed blood circulation. Death would finally come due to asphyxiation, since being forced to remain in this suspended position causes tremendous strain on the diaphragm and the rest of the respiratory system. The condemned would try to keep breathing by pressing down with their legs, which would relieve the pressure. They would normally be left in this state until they died, but if the executioners wanted it to end quickly, they would break the legs of the condemned, which would make inhaling difficult and speeding along the process. Once dead, the bodies could be taken down and the cross, or at least the upright beam, would be used again for another prisoner, but in many cases the bodies would be left attached until they decayed. At the top of the cross there would be a placard with the name of the criminal and the crimes committed, the entire spectacle a gory reminder of the power and might of Rome, and the consequences for defiance. By far the most infamous examples of crucifixion was the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, who was executed sometime in the first half of the 1st century. The largest mass crucifixion was recorded in 71 BC, when the Spartacus revolt was crushed by Marcus Licinius Crassus. In order to keep Rome's slaves in line, Crassus had 6,000 of the survivors crucified along a section of the Appian Way, stretching from Capua to Rome, an undeniable display of Roman power. Crucifixion was used as a torture and execution method until the early 4th century AD, when the newly Christianized empire ended the practice for obvious reasons. If crucifixion was a drawn-out and agonizing way to die, the Romans had another method that was faster, but much more gory, and sated the desire of the Roman masses for bloodlust and spectacle. During the matches in the Colosseum or other amphitheaters, public executions would be one of the attractions during the games. In addition to other methods of capital punishment, damnatio ad bestias befell the condemned, meaning condemnation to beasts. It's exactly what it sounds like. Take the condemned criminal, place him in the arena in front of thousands of screaming patrons, and release a hungry beast to eat them. That's pretty much it. There were some variations on how it could be done, of course. For example, the prisoner might have a weapon, so they had the illusion of a chance to survive, or they could be chained in place and unarmed, whatever the organizer or editor of the games thought would keep the crowd's attention. In some cases, the organizers would have had a flair for the dramatic, literally. Elaborate sets would be constructed, and scenes from plays or mythological stories would be acted out, with the condemned actually being killed by the beasts. Damnatio ad bestias was closely associated with the wild animal hunts, venationes, where exotic animals would be brought into the arena to be hunted by gladiators, specialist hunters, or each other. Since spectacle was the priority, not practicality, animals from the far corners of the Roman sphere of influence would be used. These most famously included lions, most likely the Barbary lion, as well as leopards, bears, and crocodiles. The condemned would also be trampled to death by elephants, bulls, and wild boars. The problem with this is that wild animals don't really care what the arena organizers expect from them and would often refuse to perform. Humans are not a natural prey animal, and even the largest and fiercest of predators would be frightened by thousands of screaming spectators. To keep the blood flowing, Rome relied heavily on specialized animal handlers called bestiari to prepare the animals. Before entering the arena, the animals would be starved. Desperate and hungry, the animals would fall on the condemned prisoners, ripping them apart while the crowd shouted their approval. This practice continued until sometime in the 4th century, ending since the gladiatorial games were waning in popularity anyway. But more to the point, the number of animals sent to the arena over the centuries was so great that the Romans were running out of wild animals to capture. The carnage of the arena caused one of the greatest ecological disasters in history. Damnatio ad bestias wasn't the only time the Romans outsourced their punishments to the animal kingdom. In the ancient Roman mind, the worst crime that can be committed was parricide, killing one's parents or other close relative. Such a heinous crime required an equally brutal punishment. Many of these criminals would be thrown to the beasts, but sometimes, rarely, they would experience something that was far, far worse. Called poena culli, or punishment of the sack, the criminal would be tied in a sack and thrown into a river to drown. Some executioners thought this wasn't nearly cruel enough. Thrown in the sack with him would be a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake. Once thrown in, the panicking animals would claw and bite at the man, compounding his suffering as he eventually drowned. According to the Roman historian Livy, around 101 BCE, Publicius Malleolus was the first man executed by this method, stating that he was tied to a sack and then thrown into the sea after killing his mother, but there is no mention of any animal involvement. The first mention of using animals came centuries later. Sometimes only snakes were used. Try wrangling an irate dog, monkey, rooster, and snake at the same time and see how it goes. Strangely, well after Rome's fall, the practice was brought back in the Middle Ages and early modern era. In 1548, a millman was executed via a sack filled with all sorts of animals, but only a cat and a dog managed to escape. Like what happened in Rome, the punishment was rarely carried out and was used more as a deterrent than an actual practice. At its height, Rome controlled up to a quarter of the world's population, and they did it with an iron fist and more than a little deranged creativity.